Imagine finding your dream business, making over £250,000 a year when everything gets ranked because of two simple but easily avoidable mistakes you make. This happened to me on my journey to buy a £1 million business. So in this video, I'm going to show you the dream business I tried to buy and exactly what wrecked everything, and explain what I do differently now to make sure it doesn't happen to you. Let me show you the deal I negotiated, because when it collapsed after a phone call, I was gutted. This was a civil engineering business doing over 2 million in sales. The seller wanted £850,000 and I negotiated it down to £480,000. The problem was I didn't have £480,000, so I had to structure it. I agreed a £220,000 deposit, and none of it was my own cash. The deposit was coming from three places: £75,000 of asset finance against the equipment, £120,000 of invoice finance against customer invoices, and £25,000 from a friend of mine for a 5% stake in the business, who also knew civil engineering and was going to come in as a director and run the company for me. The remaining £260,000 was seller financing over 60 months. The seller basically became the bank and agreed to 0% interest. On paper, the deal was as good as done and almost too good to be true. And then I received the phone call. I was at home when my phone rang. It was Ian, the owner. He said, "Russell, this is a call I really didn't want to make." My heart sank. He went on, "I've had another offer. It's £100,000 more than yours, and they're paying 100% up front." I didn't even know what to say, because in that moment, the deal was lost. So I just said, "Ian, I'm gutted this has happened, but you have to take it." I put the phone down and stared at the wall, because I realized I had just lost an amazing deal. And here's what really hit me after I put the phone down. It was me that let it happen, because the business was still being marketed. I hadn't actually locked the seller down, so anyone could come along and offer more and take it. The first mistake I made was simple. Once the seller said yes, I went straight into arranging finance and due diligence, when I should have paused and got exclusivity in writing first. Exclusivity means the seller agrees to negotiate only with you for a fixed period of time. And if there's a broker involved, it also means the listing comes down. Because if it's still being marketed, you're just one phone call away from losing the deal. But it was this second mistake which is what made it more likely to happen. Because I hadn't locked down exclusivity, the seller could still speak to other buyers whilst time was dragging on. Basically, the deal was just sitting there, exposed. Imagine you leave your front door wide open. That's what it's like when you don't get exclusivity. Anyone can just walk in. Sometimes you might get away with it for a little while, but leave the door wide open for long enough and eventually someone will walk in and take what's yours. The asset finance was relatively quick to agree, but the invoice finance was the bit that took time. Because the lender doesn't just look at the business, they also look at the people who owe the money. Basically, they ask, are these customers actually going to pay? So they wanted customer lists, what each customer owed, invoice records and bank statements, and the profit and loss and balance sheet. Gathering that information for a company you own is hard enough, but when it's a business you don't even own yet, it turns into weeks of back and forth. Looking back, the second mistake was simple. I massively underestimated how long invoice financing would take to put into place, especially when it was against invoices in a business I didn't even own yet. And that delay is what left me vulnerable, because even with exclusivity, you're still working to a deadline, which is often about 8 to 12 weeks, depending on the deal. So speed still matters, and that's the key takeaway. Even if I had exclusivity, I took way too long to arrange the finance, and it cost me the deal. But what I also hadn't seen at the time was the solution was staring me right in the face. Obvious now, but hindsight's a wonderful thing, right? Let me give you a quick example. I was involved in a 1.6 million deal where only £75,000 was paid on completion. The rest was deferred for 2 years at 0%. The plan was, after 2 years, the buyer would pay a further £325,000 and refinance the remaining 1.2 million with a bank loan. But when that refinancing point came, the bank basically treated the buyer like a new business because the deal had been done as an asset purchase into a new limited company. So even though the business had been trading for years, on paper, the buyer only had a short 2-year track record. That meant they were basically stuck with one bank. And because they had no real choice, the only offer on the table had high interest rates and high charges. After the buyer discussed their problem with the seller said, "Fine, I'll be the bank." The seller agreed to a 1.2 million long-term seller financing loan at around 7% a year. This meant they earned more than leaving the money in the bank, and the buyer got cheaper funding than they could from the lender, and the deal was done. And that's the big difference. Banks are rigid about lending and structure, whereas sellers can be more flexible. And that brings me back to my civil engineering business deal. Now, invoice financing isn't just slow, it's expensive too, as the quote worked out at just under 15% a year. So, what do you do when the lending is taking forever to agree and it comes back very expensive? Well, here's exactly what I should have done and what I'd do now with hindsight if I saw this deal again. I could see early on it was taking far too long to get the invoice finance approved, but that's where this works in your favour, because it gives you a strong argument for a different solution, especially when the seller wants it done quickly, like mine did. So I should have gone back to the owner and said, "Let's change the structure. Instead of waiting for invoice finance, will you add £120,000 onto the seller financing instead? That way we can complete faster and I'll pay you interest on it too." I'd much rather pay the seller 6 to 8% on that £120,000 and get the deal done than waste time with invoice finance and risk losing the deal altogether. For him, it would make sense too. He wanted the deal done quickly and he didn't need the cash because on completion, he was also taking out around £340,000 of surplus cash that was sat in the business. So he still gets £100,000 upfront as a deposit, we complete faster, and on that extra £120,000, he earns more than he would by putting it in the bank. And that's what I missed at the time. The moment I saw invoice finance taking too long, I should have stopped and restructured the deal. But because I let the finance drag on, I lost the whole deal. And that cost me a business doing £250,000 plus a year in cash flow. If I'd renegotiated, I genuinely think I would have completed that deal. Now, here's the part that would have stopped me being gazumped in the first place. If I'd found that deal before it came to the open market, I'd likely have been the only buyer looking at it. There'd be no broker in the middle, and there'd be far less risk of someone else being introduced at the last minute with a higher cash offer. That's why one of the best ways to avoid this risk is to focus on off-market deals, where you're not competing with other buyers. Watch this next video and I'll show you exactly how to find off-market businesses to buy.